Okay, continuing chapter 11, Roots of Popular Music. We are up to what can only be called a phenomenon. Certainly of the disco era, but quite frankly, of pop culture in the 1970s in general. There was an actor on a TV show named John Travolta. He was well known as a TV actor, but he hadn't done much, if anything, in movies. And a producer by the name of Robert Stigwood decided to do a movie about the disco life, the disco culture. And what the disco culture involved, quite frankly, was really about a look. It was about how you looked, how you dressed, how you danced, and how you sort of put it all together. The disco era was famous for, among other things, Studio 54, a very famous, the most famous discotheque in Manhattan at the time. It set up the tradition of the rope that you had to stand behind and wait, and the doorman would come and say, "You can come in, but you can't." And it was based entirely on the whim of the doorman and how you looked and whether you were a fit for the club that night or whatever. It was the lifestyle. And then you add on to that, cocaine, and you wind up with a subculture that Stigwood felt merited replicating on film. So he created this movie called Saturday Night Fever, and he hired John Travolta to star in it. Travolta did a great job. A great job. He was nominated, deservedly so. He was nominated for an Academy Award for his performance. And the film was very successful, made a lot of money, made Travolta a star. But as successful as the movie was, and it was very successful, it was nothing compared to the success of the music it contained, the soundtrack in particular. The soundtrack was comprised of a lot of different songs. Disco Inferno by the Tramps, The Fifth of Beethoven that you heard by Walter Murphy, Boogie Shoes by Casey and the Sunshine Band. There were a lot of different songs, More Than a Woman by Tavares, a lot of different songs on the soundtrack. But of greatest prominence on the soundtrack were songs by the Bee Gees. Now, the Bee Gees were three brothers, Barry and his younger twin brothers, Morris and Robin. And they were, if I remember correctly, born in Australia but moved to England when they were kids. And, or maybe the other way around. Anyway, um, they emerged in the mid 60s, not quite part of the British invasion, sort of on the tail end, but they emerged to produce some hits in the States. And that took them up until the early 70s, but then a bit of a family falling out took them out of the recording studio for a couple of years. When they came back, disco had sort of moved in, and the Bee Gees fell right into it. They produced some great disco songs, and one after another, the songs kept getting better. So when Stigwood wanted some original music done for Saturday Night Fever, he thought of Barry, Robin, and Morris Gibb, and boy, did they produce. They most famously created a song called Stayin' Alive, which is played over the opening credits of the movie, much of which shows Travolta's feet going down the street in Brooklyn. But give a listen to Stayin' Alive, the absolute classic by the Bee Gees. As iconic as Stayin' Alive is, and as associated with Saturday Night Fever as it was actually the second song released from the album. The first song released was um, the ballad piece that the Bee Gees had come up with. It's a great song. It's been redone a couple of times in different styles, and it plays very well. A number one smash by the brothers called "How Deep Is Your Love" from Saturday Night Fever, the Bee Gees. Great tune. How Deep Is Your Love? The third number one record from Saturday Night Fever was called Night Fever. Give a listen. Those three songs, How Deep Is Your Love, Staying Alive, and Night Fever, were all hit number one in late 77, early 78. And the Bee Gees monopolized the charts at that time in a way that nobody had done since the Beatles. And they were, without question, the biggest act of those couple of years. And Saturday Night Fever became the number one album of 1978. It sold millions of copies. It stayed at number one for 24 weeks, and it would remain the biggest movie soundtrack ever until Whitney Houston's The Bodyguard soundtrack overtook it some 15 or so years later. But Bee Gees' Saturday Night Fever, astonishingly popular and important music from 1977. And again, Saturday Night Fever, the biggest album of 78. Now, the Bee Gees were so predominant in the music that was going on. Their sound was everywhere. And the more popular they became, the more other acts wanted to sound like them. And it was, in fact, the popularity of the Bee Gees that put the disco music kind of over the edge, if you will. It took a couple of years for the revolt to really play out, but most famously at Soldiers Field in Chicago in the early, it was 1980, 1981, there was a disco burn that was everybody could bring their disco albums and just throw them on a bonfire. And it was the omnipresence of the Bee Gees on the radio that sort of, I think, put it over the top as much as anything. Part of the thing with the Bee Gees was that it wasn't just them. They produced other artists and they had a very distinct sound. And so other artists they worked with, Yvonne Elliman, Samantha Sang, wound up sounding like them. Nobody was this more the case than with their younger brother, Andy, a bit of a teen heartthrob, but a talent in his own right. But his music was often written and or produced, at least in part, by his brothers. One of his biggest hits from 78, Shadow Dancing. This is Andy Gibb. Andy Gibb, Shadow Dancing, huge hit record from 78, out just a few weeks after Night Fever. So it felt very much like the Bee Gees were still on the charts. Okay. Travolta. As big as John Travolta became after Saturday Night Fever, things were about to get even crazier for him. As much money as Saturday Night Fever had made, it wasn't anything compared to what was going to happen with Grease. Now, the soundtrack to Grease was huge. Was huge. It wasn't as big as Saturday Night Fever, but it was huge. In fact, it became the second biggest album of 1978, and 1978 became the only year since 64 all the way up to today where the top two albums of the year were both from movie soundtracks. A little bit of trivia. So Grease was a huge soundtrack, but as a movie goes, Grease made goo gobs of money. Saturday Night Fever was a big hit movie and a monster soundtrack. Grease was a monster movie with a big hit soundtrack. All right. Travolta, who had proven in Saturday Night Fever that he could act and that he could dance, also added singer to the mix in Grease. He and Olivia Newton-John, an Australian singer who was one of the biggest female vocalists of the 70s, they teamed up in Grease, and the first record released from the soundtrack hit number one, called You're the One That I Want, John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John. John and Olivia followed up You're the One That I Want with another top five smash from Grease called Summer Nights. Now, the title track from Grease was the song Grease. And it was written and produced by, I believe it was by Barry Gibb, but it was the Bee Gees, basically. It was the same sound. And it was sung by Frankie Valli, who was the lead singer of that group we studied a few weeks ago, whose name I'm sure you remember. So Grease was a huge record, and the title track from the movie. And Frankie Valli took this Bee Gees produced confection all the way to number one. That's Grease, Frankie Valli. All right, I'll see you on the other side.